Let's look at the two passages. First, in Romans 3:31, Paul makes clear that what he's teaching about faith does not nullify the law, but rather establish the law. So when he's talking about the law there, he means the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, within which is the teaching, beginning at Genesis 15:6, that we are justified by faith, that we come into right relationship with God first by trusting him, and it's out of that that our works flow. So that's his point there. What I'm teaching about faith, he's saying, that doesn't nullify what the Torah teaches. In fact, that establishes it because it puts it in its proper place. Also in that context, he explains that the role of the Torah was not to make people righteous, but to show them their guilt before God so that they would need to turn to God for mercy and forgiveness. So in that sense, we're properly understanding Torah thereby putting it in its proper place rather than nullifying it. Now, what about Romans 10:4? The key thing is the word telos there. Aside from the fact that it's ludicrous to think that Paul would contradict himself within the very same letter of careful teaching to the Romans, we have to ask then, what does that word telos mean? Telos can mean end. Telos can also mean goal. We get the word in telescope and things like that. So what Paul is saying is not that Christ, Messiah, is the end of the law for everyone who believes. So once you believe in him, that terminates the law. No, rather, Messiah is the goal to which the Torah is pointing so that everyone who believes in him can be justified. So he's really saying the same thing in both of those places. By rightly understanding the role of the Torah and by rightly understanding what the Torah teaches about faith, it establishes it, and we see that the Messiah is ultimately the goal to which the Torah is pointing. Once we take telos and instead of translating it with end, translate it with goal, the objection disappears. The idea that Paul or whoever wrote Hebrews had a greater revelation than Jesus is complete nonsense. Paul was the bondslave of Jesus, Yeshua. Not only that, this is one of the foundational things that Jesus laid out in Matthew 5 and then repeated again in Luke 16. And he said plainly that he didn't come to abolish the Torah of the prophets, but to fulfill. So first let's think about what he did with regard to the Torah and the prophets. He took the ethical requirements of the law to a higher standard. He didn't abolish them. For example, adultery, he now said, thinking the thought in your heart is a form of adultery. Hatred is a form of murder. So he took the ethical moral requirements to a deeper level. Everything that had to do with our approach to God, things like temple, sacrifice, priesthood, blood, he brings to fullness in his own life and death and resurrection. The full meaning of the sacrifices, that to which they're pointing. And then the feasts and the holy days find their prophetic meaning in his death, resurrection, outpouring of the Spirit, and eventually in his return. So we see that all of what came before was pointing towards him, finding its full meaning in him. Even the concept of Sabbath, when he says in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest," is in the context of the way of religious tradition, which we see in the next chapter, versus finding true Sabbath rest in him. So he's saying everything is pointing towards him. The emphasis in Hebrews is that now that the new has come, there's a new covenant that's been made, and that's explicit in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, that the Sinai covenant would come to an end, and that God would make a new and better covenant and take the truths of Torah, take Torah and write it in the hearts of his people, and there'd be a supernatural empowerment to keep these things. And we experience the realities of the new covenant already, but in fullness at the end of this age. So how do you put the two things together? The regulations of the covenant, the blood sacrifices, we haven't had them anymore. Hebrews might well have been written right before the temple was destroyed, and he's saying this is about to fade away. The earthly priesthood functioning at an earthly temple, we haven't had. If you will take the bulk of the legal material of the Torah and compile it, you'll see about 75% of the commandments that are for all time, for all generations, forever, we cannot keep without a functioning temple, priesthood, and Jewish self-governance in the land. So when we look at this material and realize all these things that were forever, the blood sacrifices, a lot of the priestly rituals, we can't keep anymore, we can't do. What's happened? Something new and better, that to which it was pointing, has come. So if it was abolished, done away with, then let's throw out the biblical calendar. Let's throw out the importance of blood sacrifice. Let's throw out the morality of the Torah, and let's do whatever in the world we want and divorce ourselves from this. No, the opposite has happened. Everything to which it was pointing has now come in its fullness. It has been filled up to the full. So the old regulations and rituals that were part of the previous covenant are no longer applicable because the full meaning of the covenant has come to pass. And it's only when you understand that God didn't abolish it or destroy it. It's like going from a typewriter to a computer. That to which it was pointing has now come, so you don't need the typewriter because you have the computer, but it's based on that model that the fullness has come. We get reconciliation from at least two angles. One angle would be for Gentiles to recognize that according to Paul, the law is holy, just, and good. For Gentile believers to meditate on Psalm 19 and Psalm 119, which praise the wonders and beauties of the law, and to recognize they were primarily talking about the 5 books of Moses there. So for Gentiles to regain a healthy appreciation of Torah, to see that as a foundational pillar on which everything else is built, that's really essential and important. Now, on the flip side, if we can recognize that by the works of the law, we cannot be made right with God. The last recorded words of Peter are found in Acts, the 15th chapter, within the book of Acts, his last recorded words, when the question is, do Gentiles have to become Jews? Do they have to be circumcised and come under the law of Moses in order to be saved? And he said, no. It's by the grace of God that we are saved just as they, by the grace of the Lord Yeshua. And those are his last words recorded in the book of Acts. The bridge to the other side is for Jewish people to recognize that with all their best works, with all their best efforts, they'll still fall short, and that the Torah itself points to the need for God's grace, points to the need for a gift of atonement, points to the need of trusting God before we can obey him. So Gentiles have to appreciate the beauty and riches of the Torah. Jews have to appreciate that the Torah points to blood sacrifice, death and resurrection of Messiah, our need for grace and mercy, and being justified with God by faith. And that's where the two can meet. There are several different dimensions that we have to look at. First, the feasts, the biblical calendar, these were given as gifts to the Jewish people. This was not bondage. This was a gift to the Jewish people. This is part of a special heritage. This was something that would tie Israel back in with its history and ultimately have Israel looking ahead to the future. This is something that would help keep Israel be separate from the nations by having a distinct calendar. So in and of themselves, there's nothing negative about them. There's nothing bad about them. This is all positive and wonderful and should be recognized as such. They are the feasts of the Lord, the holy days of the Lord. What God was against, and Isaiah 1 mentions it, Amos 5 you mentioned is against it, Jeremiah 6 and 7 have references against it as well, Micah 6, Hosea 6. There are different passages, Psalm 40, that would seem to indicate that God didn't want these anymore, that he was sick and tired of them. In the prophetic passages that I mentioned, what he was sick and tired of was hypocritical worship. For example, in Isaiah 1, he says, I don't want you trampling my courts. He said, I don't want you lifting your hands in prayer because your hands are stained with blood. He said, I don't want your holy days, convocations. I don't want your Sabbaths. So they had taken something sacred and made it abominable. Proverbs says even the prayer of the wicked is an abomination. So we know prayer is a wonderful thing. And Isaiah 1 says, I don't want it. I don't want you raising your hands. So the problem was not the feast. The problem was not prayer. The problem was not the Sabbath. The problem was hypocrisy. The problem was people with a wicked heart now thinking if I just keep the outward routines, God will be happy with me. It would be like God telling a pastor in his church, I don't want your tithes. I don't want your Sunday services. I don't want your hymns. You're hypocrites. The problem was not with the tithes or the Sunday services or the hymns. The problem was with hypocrisy. Now, what about some of these New Testament texts that you mentioned? We know that in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul writes to the Corinthians and tells them to keep the feast of Passover, that Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. whether he means it metaphorically, spiritually keep the feast, or whether he actually means that they should observe it, either way it wasn't a negative. It was not something that would pull them down or be anti-spirituality. In Colossians 2 and in Galatians 4, he's dealing with some issues. In Galatians, where there was a legalism and a teaching that you had to be circumcised and obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. In Colossians, it seems that there was some of that teaching, but more mingled with a type of Gnosticism and other mystical Jewish beliefs and angelic worship, some odd type of religious mix that they were getting into. And somehow they got to a point, these are Gentiles now, not Jews, remember. God never commanded the whole Gentile believing world to keep all the feasts. That's where you have that one reference that Paul makes, could be metaphorical or not, but there's nowhere where it was taught in all the letters, you must keep all the feasts. Yet they were now judging spirituality based on, are you keeping the Sabbath? Are you keeping the feast? And Paul said, no, these are shadows. The reality is found in the Messiah, and you have lost connection with the head. Similar to the hypocrisy things. What in the world is the use of your new moons and your Sabbaths and your holy festivals when you've lost sight of what they're actually pointing towards? You've concentrated on the shadow and lost sight of the reality. He doesn't forbid them from keeping these things, but he says your emphasis is wrong and you've gotten detached from the head. That is a problem I have seen with some believers that get so excited about the observance of days and new moons and feasts and festivals, they lose attachment with Jesus, Yeshua. They get so caught up with the shadow, they lose sight of the reality. As far as the Galatians, either they had fallen prey to thinking they had to keep all the Jewish holy days and new moons and Sabbaths, etc., in order to be right with God, and he's criticizing that, or they were also involved in some type of astral worship and sacred holy days. We know that there's nothing wrong with having holy days. And the Christians who often criticize Gentile believers and say you shouldn't keep the holy days, you shouldn't keep the seventh-day Sabbath, you shouldn't keep the feast, that's wrong. They have no problem keeping Sunday Sabbath, celebrating Easter, celebrating Christmas. So it's not wrong to say that these days are sacred for us in the Lord. It's wrong when either you judge spirituality based on that, it's wrong when you think I have to be right with God based on doing these things and I'm justified by doing them, or when you mingle in, as the Galatians may have, a wrong notion about the law with pagan practices as well. That's what Paul was dealing with. But the idea that it's wrong to keep the feast today, absolutely not. For Jewish believers, it's a way to connect back to their heritage, and it's a great way to teach the family and to tell the larger Jewish community we are connected. For Gentile believers, as long as it's not done with bondage or an obligatory sense, it's a great way to tie back in with Jewish roots, to see the prophetic significance of the holy days, and even to tell the Jewish community, hey, we are part of you. We don't have a separate alien religion. Rather, this is what your faith is pointing towards. I would first say that Jewish people may not take offense at Easter, but it further confirms to them that this is a foreign religion. It is separate. We have Passover, they have Easter. We have Hanukkah, they have Christmas. We have our faith, they have their faith. This further confirms that because it does seem to be utterly separate to them. They're not cognizant of the idea that Yeshua died at the time of Passover. They're not cognizant of the fact that he rose with first fruits, that he sent his Spirit at Shavuot, at the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, etc. So this further confirms the separateness. For reconciliation, it's a tall order, and it's almost like fighting City Hall. It's going to have to take God's grace to turn things. But ideally, the church should go back to the earlier custom of celebrating the death and resurrection of Jesus at the same time every year that the Jewish community celebrates the Passover. Within the first few centuries of what we call Christianity, there was a division. One part of what was called the early church, or what we call the early church, these are the Gentile believers in Jesus. One part would celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus at the same time that the Jewish community would celebrate the Passover. Another group said, no, every year we celebrate the death on Friday and the resurrection on Sunday. And ultimately, under Constantine, they said, we want to make a separation. We do not want to be dependent on these cursed Jews for their calendar, and we don't want to be partaking of their customs. So there was a very ugly and arrogant separation that took place. What I say is, it's perfectly fine to celebrate Messiah's death on a Friday and resurrection on a Sunday, because he did rise on a Sunday. and we believe he died on a Friday. So do that during the Passover season. I encourage churches, and again, it's a tall order because Easter Sunday is a big thing, and the Easter egg hunts and the family coming together and all this stuff. But to the extent churches are willing to do this, throw out the Easter terminology because that is unnecessarily divisive. Talk about Passover and first fruits, and in that context, the death and resurrection of Yeshua. So I have no problem with it being celebrated, his death on a Friday and his resurrection on a Sunday, but do it within the Passover season. That's a way to bridge a gap. It may not be chronologically exact, but it's a way to bridge a gap to say when you're celebrating Passover, we're celebrating Messiah's death. And during this very season, we're doing the same thing. And then to look at the 1 Corinthians 5 passage and to say, as the Jewish community is not eating bread, what can we do to get the leaven out of our midst spiritually? And to really concentrate on that as a season of spiritual purification together with the Jewish people. I do believe that spiritually will come in much better alignment, and it'll be part of the way that God regathers the Jews to their faith in Jesus the Messiah and regathers the church to its Jewish roots, and they can come together around that.
The Hebraic Roots Conference will be held this fall, October 13th through the 15th. This conference is free, but space is limited, so please register your attendance online at HebraicRootsConference.com, or you can call 952-657-7879.